Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
So we ended Genesis 22 with the Akedah and the promise of Isaac's wife, Rebekah. And then we go to Genesis 23, and it seems like pretty abruptly, Sarah passes away. She dies at age 127.
Yeah, this is a bit of a short chapter, and there's not an enormous amount to it. So we'll see how quickly we can get through it. But there are some interesting things that do happen in this chapter. So, Genesis chapter 23, starting in verse 1. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Stopping here for a second, the word used for mourning here is lipsod, and the word is surprisingly not used very often in the Bible. It's used a couple of times. Two times that I saw it's used in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 12, when David is mourning over the death of Saul and Jonathan. And it's used in Jeremiah 22:10 in reference to the exile of the Jews from their homeland. Jeremiah is tied pretty tightly to the concept of Lamentations. They literally have a whole book written about the Lamentations of Jeremiah. And as far as David and Jonathan is the person in this world that David really loved. And their very close bond and friendship is something of a narrative focus in the early parts of David's story as he's becoming the man who would be king. So the few times that we do see this used in the Bible, it seems to be reinforcing the idea of extreme lamentation. Deep from the heart, you feel nothing but immense sorrow type of grieving. And this is meant to signify how much Abraham loved Sarah. And I think this is a good thing to remember because we've gone through their story for a while, and there have been a lot of ups and downs and a lot of dumb things done by Abraham and a lot of dumb things done by Sarah. But in the end, Abraham really loved Sarah, and Sarah really loved Abraham. And we don't see a lot of that in biblical relationships.
Yeah, you get this idea that the relationships that were between a husband and a wife, especially in ancient times, were transactional, or like a wife was given to a man because that's just the way it was done. They traded for it or bartered for it, or maybe it was like an arranged marriage for an upper class person. But typically you don't hear about love stories back then. And the Bible does a good job with certain chapters in the Bible of depicting a loving relationship. Proverbs 31 has this ideal wife, and then you have Song of Solomon, which talks about the romantic aspect, but can be confusing. But when you see it in plain language like this, like later on in these chapters, as we'll read, Isaac truly loved Rebekah. You don't really hear that too often, and that's what makes this story very special.
And there is something truly unique and special about a relationship between one man and one woman who truly love one another. Not something that's just set up for convenience, or something that's set up just so that two families can come together and produce kids, and it'll be some kind of alliance, in a sense, between two groups of people. Mm-hmm. This is a man and a woman, and they loved one another, and they were deeply flawed, but the mistakes they made together and their successes they had together, they were biblically as one. The two became one flesh. And so it's very clear that when Sarah died here, a part of Abraham went with her.
Yeah, I think that even further with the way that Abraham arranges for her burial, because this is the first person since he's left his father that we hear about dying in his family. And he makes this huge point, that's a majority of this chapter, in negotiating the burial of Sarah and then securing this site for the rest of his family for these generations that have been promised.
I think that's actually a very important point to make, because in Genesis chapter 23, starting in verse 3, then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. Remember, a long time ago in Abraham's story, he was promised this land, This is the land God has given him. He's still a wanderer in it. Even at this point in his life, and now his wife is dead. He does have Isaac at this point, but the land promised to him still isn't his, and he still doesn't consider it to be his. It's the land of the Hittites. And so this is the part where he finally, after all this time, gets some land in this land promised to him that's his, and it's only for burying dead.
Well, and it's something he paid for. It was like God promised it to him, but man still required some sort of transaction to make it official. So the promised land wasn't just something that God tore down walls and killed a bunch of people. Like, a fair transaction took place. And Abraham might have spiritually been the owner of that land, but he still had to go through hoops and a lot of negotiating to get to the point where he could say that he owned that.
And to simply say that something is promised to you doesn't mean that God is going to hand it to you on a silver platter. In a sense, that's what happened with Isaac, but not really. There was a very long journey that Abraham and Sarah had to go through before they finally became the people that they needed to be for Isaac. And in the same way, while this land was promised to Abraham, one, he's not the one who gets to see the fulfillment of that promise. This is the promise that the nation of Israel holds on to, even while they're in Egypt. They hold on to the fact that this is the land they have been promised, and one day they have to come back. But this is finally the point where some small part of that promise is fulfilled. Abraham buys a part of this land that will one day become his nation's land, their home. But it takes so long to get to this point. So many of the promises given to Abraham take so long to fulfill and don't come into full fulfillment until after he's dead.
So Abraham speaks to the Hittites and he asks them for land or property for the burial, and they go back and forth. So the Hittites answer Abraham, "Hear us, my lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead." Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, "If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah." I don't know how to pronounce that.
Machpelah.
Yeah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. So they're saying, have anything you want from us. We consider you one of us. And he's, no, I know the exact lot that I want. I know where it is, who owns it, and how much it's worth. Let me offer that. And they respond. And Ephron the Hittite was there, and he said, "No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field. I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead." Then Abraham bowed down. So he shows them honor. But then he says to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, "But if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me that I may bury my dead there." And Ephron answers Abraham, "My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." He still weighs out the silver. He still pays him. And then he becomes the legal owner of the land. That's a lot of back and forth. Really, like, they're being very generous to him. So why wouldn't he want to accept that?
Yeah, I think it connects similar to the story when he rescued Sodom and Gomorrah from danger, and they offered him a prize for that, and he didn't want to take it.
This is in Genesis 14.
Yeah.
He says, "I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say that I've made Abram rich."
So I think it's a similar connection there is these outside nations are offering him something that they could either later take back and have ownership of, or it is something they could boast that, oh yeah, we've helped him out. He's part of us now. He has assimilated into our culture, and he is a Hittite now, not a chosen man of God.
Yeah. So do you want to chat for a minute? I know we haven't had a ton of time to review it, but do we want to chat about the Hittite views of the afterlife and the significance of this type of burial?
No, I think Hittite and just other beliefs in burial are very similar. Like, this follows pretty similar to how the ancient Hebrews viewed the afterlife and Sheol and this holding place. You have Abraham's bosom for those that are good, and then
this is the Jewish belief.
Yes.
Yeah.
And very similar to Hittite belief and other A&E beliefs as well. There's this inner earth dwelling place where all spirits go after they die. Even Egyptian afterlife views are similar. So it relates. The request to bury Sarah relates to the Hittites, and they want to respect that for Abraham.
Yeah, and there's a bit that you had mentioned there, Cody, that I want to dive a little bit further into, where you talked about how him doing this would effectively make him a Hittite. The exact wording that they use there is, "You are a mighty prince among us. You may bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb for burying your dead." They were basically welcoming him into their family. They're saying, we already consider you to be one of us, so bury your dead among ours.
Which translation are you using?
The one that I'm looking at right now is from mekonmamre.org. What they say, it more elevated English, but basically what I just read, which is, "Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres, bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead." So basically the same thing. But what's interesting is that it can be interpreted either way. And I'm butchering the pronunciation here because I don't know the exact word or how to pronounce it, but I think this is Neshi Elohim. And the name Elohim should sound some alarms. Elohim is a fairly versatile word. It can mean judge, but generally it's a reference to either God proper or the gods. But here it seems to mean either just you are a leader or you are a leader of God. So it can mean either of those things. And I think it's fair that the version that you're looking at does include of God. And there's the footnote or just leader.
Yeah, I just think
prince.
it's good to keep in mind like personal interpretation, because if you read that verse, it looks like it's implying that these people know God and acknowledge God's authority or something and are trying to bless Abraham because of it. And that may not really be what's going on. Like, it sounds like they're honoring him. Abimelech honored him, gave him a place of honor, but I don't know.
I think it's still fair to say that these people know who God is. Abimelech knows who God is. They're in an area that's governed more or less by Melchizedek, who we believe is Michael. So this is...
But their response might not be spiritual.
We can have the best intentions in saying something. And this, on its face, is actually a very heartfelt gesture. They're saying, come into our family. We love you. You are a mighty prince of God among us, or even just a mighty prince, whatever. The idea is that they are saying, we recognize you as an authority, and we recognize you as an authority among us. So why wouldn't we let you bury your dead amongst ours? And any other time that would actually make a lot of sense. But the problem is that Abraham has been told he is going to be made into a mighty nation if he is welcomed into the Hittites. One, we know where the Hittites eventually end up, and it's not a good place. But also, that means that Abraham is no longer a mighty nation himself. He would be going against what God has said, which is that he will become a mighty nation. And that is done through Isaac. So he's staying faithful to God, despite the fact it would be very easy for him to say, you know what? Yeah, I will become a prince among you guys. I'll bury your dead amongst you. And now this will finally be my home. But that's not what he says.
No, he's very insistent that he pay for it and that it be done like officially. And I find that to be very interesting because it does really remind me of the situation with the king of Sodom in Genesis 14. But it also talks about just this like permanence. Like, he knows God has said, this is the promised land to you, but there will be no contesting of legal ownership if it's done through the right channels, instead of just, yeah, sure, take it. Like, we love you. Just take it. Just have it. And he's no, because if it ever were to be contested, or if there ever were a situation where somebody could question the ownership, like, it's undeniable. I have legal rights. And I think that's important because this is a generational tomb. This tomb ends up holding his entire family and generations of his family. And now today, this supposed site is an honored holy place in Israel. I think he knew that the importance of buying it would mean that it was a forever thing, not just like when we think about cemeteries, I have grandparents buried in Pennsylvania. I have relatives that live in Ohio and were cremated, and they have a headstone in Ohio. Like, our families migrated all over the world, and now you see these ancient cemeteries or 500-year-old cemeteries or whatever, and they hold old bodies, but it's not the same significance as like, this land was promised by God. This is a different way of doing things than just, hey, you might be a wandering sojourner, but this is like an act of permanence that meant a lot to Abraham, because he knew that he needed to be set apart among these people, but he still needed to stay there. And you see that later because he talks about that with Isaac and finding Isaac a wife.
Yeah, so the thing that's interesting to me about this is he won't take the land for free from Ephron, and he wouldn't take it from the Sodomites. He wouldn't take the money or reward from the Sodomites. But anytime that he interacted with the kings, like he got money and possessions from Abimelech, he got money and possessions from the Pharaoh of Egypt when there was that Sarah interaction. So it is weird that he would take those and not this. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's one of the questions that I have.
We talked a lot about that in one of the recent episodes, just like how dishonorable it was and how Abimelech called him. And then God held Abraham accountable, like with you need to be the one to undo this, pray for them. And I think, where Abraham behaved dishonorably, he had to pay for it in different ways. He paid for it through the grief and heartache of having Hagar and Ishmael, and the heartache that Sarah had from seeing them, but then also the heartache and burden of getting them to leave. And then with Abimelech, he had the accountability of having to pray for Abimelech and his people and their fertility. So I think God did restore Abraham through action of repentance. But I also believe that here he is trying to be honorable, and he has turned over this new leaf, and he's grieving very deeply. So like, it's easy to make emotional decisions when you're grieving. Like, we've grieved a lot, and it's easy to get angry and to be sensitive in those times. And yet you see this posture of humility from Abraham here. He's not budging. He's not going to just let somebody wrap him up in a hug and take care of him and make him a casserole and make everything better. No, I know God's purpose and I'm going to stick to it. And that's valuable. That's a great character trait of Abraham that we're seeing develop here. I don't know if that answers it for you. I know it's still uncomfortable, but
no, it doesn't answer it, and it's probably one of those things that won't get answered. But
it's
going through these texts, that's one thing that stood out to me, is that he would take what looks like a bride price for Sarah for these kings, and then he turns around and won't accept land for the burial of Sarah. And there's some Jewish tradition around this that basically is saying that the money that I gave them is what paid for the land here, and some different stuff like that. But that doesn't seem like a solidified plan of God to me. I don't think God would encourage sending your wife to another man and, oh yeah, that, by the way, that's what you're going to use to pay for the land that you bury her in.
I agree. I think that we can get to an understanding if we take this instance in isolation. I don't know that we can fully get behind or understand the other instances, but as far as just this one instance, I can see a lot of reasons as to why Abraham would say no. The idea that he's paying for it, and so it's an official transaction. No one can say, hey, we gifted this to you, what's the deal? And the initial rejection absolutely makes sense to me. The idea that they're just saying, you are a part of us, we are a part of you, become one of us, basically, we see you as our prince, and he says, no, I'm sorry, but no. Then the second stage, okay, that's fine, we'll gift you a tomb. No, this needs to be done, I will give you. In many ways, I also think this is, in a sense, an apology. It's, no, I've taken advantage of you in the past, I want to do this right. I want to give you what you are owed.
Yeah. Here we are thousands of years later, and we're like, what's your deal, Abraham? Like, why'd you do this so many times to your poor wife? Or maybe she's not so poor, I don't know. But he knew, I think, that what he did was messed up. And he definitely wanted to operate differently than he ever had.
And better late than never.
Yeah, that's the whole story of Abraham. It's this story of refinement that we can hopefully relate to, because that should be our goal. So Abraham went to all of this trouble to purchase this cave. And then we see later in his story how frequently this cave is used to bury his relatives. So Sarah gets buried in this cave. Then Abraham gets buried there when he passes away. Isaac is buried there. Jacob asks to be buried there. And actually in Jewish tradition, Rachel is the only one not buried there. Later on, Herod the Great built a large structure on this site, and it is considered a holy site by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. If you look at the pictures online, like just Google Cave of the Patriarchs, and you'll see this huge building that's right on top of it. And it is hard to imagine that at one point this was like a cave next to a field. It is so, that was one thing that Cody and I noticed about going to Israel. Like all of the things that are described in scripture don't exist anymore the way that they once did. Scholars are fairly certain that this is the accurate site for being the Cave of the Patriarchs, although no archaeological access has been granted to verify the remains or access the actual cave because it is considered a holy site by the Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So this cave is very meaningful to Abraham, and the cave to this day has been honored as the burial site in the Promised Land for this promise that God made to Abraham long ago. That brings us to Genesis 24.
Yeah. About the cave, though, like the cave and the purchase, I still think it's interesting that even after Abraham becomes a landowner in the land he's promised, through the rest of Genesis, honestly, until we get to Joshua, they're still considered sojourners. Like they're still considered travelers in the land, living off of the other inhabitants and owners of the land. It's not till conquest in Joshua that they inherit the land God promised, the promised land.
But in Genesis 24, which is where we're headed, Abraham makes very clear points that Isaac is not to go back to the original land where Abraham came from. So he's trying to get away from this title of wanderer for his son. God has made it very clear through his dealings with Abraham that the promised land is where Isaac needs to stay. So Abraham is a wanderer, but he doesn't view his son that way.
The Bible views his son that way.
But he's trying to honor the inheritance that God has given.
No, I think he's working towards that, and I think this is where it transitions into it. This seems like the starting point for, he's gotten the covenantal son that is going to have the quantity and quality. And Isaac, that's where the nations are going to be spread, and he's going to have many sons. But now you also see his transition into, this is my land. Like, we're going to stay put and stay where we've been called instead of being called up again.
But what's interesting is that Abraham has been told that eventually his descendants are going to leave here and then come back. This was actually done as a reminder back in Genesis chapter 15. Verse 16, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So yes, he was promised that his people, his descendants, would leave and be sojourners again for a very long time in Egypt and eventually come back in the fourth generation. So Abraham does know, unfortunately, that it's going to be a while before this land that's been promised to him is actually going to be his descendants. And thankfully, God actually told him this already, so he's prepared for it. But it is sad, you see him seeing himself as a sojourner his entire life, and finally has something of the promised land at this point for him and his family. And I know that's definitely not something he wants for Isaac. He does want him to have somewhat of a normal life. And to be fair, Isaac kind of does have the most normal life out of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah, you don't get a whole lot of info on Isaac, so it seems like he lived a relatively quiet life.
With just a couple crazy kids.
Yeah, I know. Commonly described meddling wife, but we'll get there.
All right, so Genesis chapter 24. Or do we have anything else for 23?
That's all I've got. We get to talk about the thigh thing.
Yay!
The covenant.
So Abraham is very old here in Genesis 24, and he is still grieving Sarah's death, and he goes to his oldest servant in his household and kind of makes a deal with him.
In verse 2, it says, and Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make You swear by the Lord, the God of the heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among who I dwell. So we've mentioned this thigh covenant, this thigh agreement before, but this is what we were talking about. So it is a A&E practice to make a covenant and to swear on future generations of your livelihood and your clan name and all of that. And that's was of the utmost value back then. So that's what you would swear on. If this covenant's broken, then your future lineage is also broken. So yeah, that's what the thigh means. It's not really a thigh.
There's a difference here between the covenant that God had with Abraham and then like a man-to-man covenant.
Yeah, this is not a God-to-man covenant or man-to-God covenant. This is a man-to-man covenant. This is basically Abraham saying, promise me that you'll do what I'm asking of you, and the servant saying yes.
Of course, the servant does still take God into account and does pray to him frequently in his attempt to fulfill this covenant with Abraham. So in a sense, God is still present in this. But yes, it is still a covenant ultimately between two men.
Yep.
And then tying the last chapter, 23, into this new chapter, it seems to be very important that Abraham's line does not get muddied with this Hittite civilization or Canaanite civilization. So he's saying that God has said where they will find a wife, and God has said that that Isaac can't go there, but also can't marry someone where they're at right now.
Yeah, it's interesting that this pops up because that is one of the rules of Israel once it becomes established as Israel, of not intermarrying with the Canaanites or anyone in the region of the Promised Land was highly prohibited. They still do it and they break that, but Abraham also has that rule set forth here as well for Isaac, is we're going to... There's something off about these cultures that he doesn't want to incorporate into his household.
He's got this probably a little bit of PTSD from the raining sulfur that he saw in his lifetime and what getting involved with the locals might do.
I think it's also he's remembering it was through Sarah that he was supposed to have Isaac, and he knew that. But he tried to take things into his own hands, and he had a child with Hagar, who was one of the local women from Egypt who had been with him. And so it was the easy option. I think he has this sense that it's through his family and just his family that the promise of God is supposed to be fulfilled. And he's trying to be faithful through that. And once again, they're faced with the easy option because the Hittites adore him. They do. And he has a very good reputation with them. So it would be the easiest thing ever to find the most beautiful of all the Hittite women and the most respectable in the families and marry into it. But that's not what he wants. And that could also provide complications if he were to marry into the Hittite family. Just as burying his dead with them would have melded the two families, absolutely marrying into a family would have caused issues down the line.
Yeah, and we know that in verses 6 and 7 of this chapter, Abraham talks about instructions that were given to him by the Lord. It's just we don't have like quoted interactions here. So the evidence points to God spoke with and walked with Abraham frequently throughout his life. And while we do have the benefit of some of those conversations, not all of them are perfectly recorded. And Abraham says in these verses that he has these instructions. Isaac can't go back to where his family is from, and he can't marry one of the locals. And it's like God said so. And we don't have more than that. Sometimes in these instances, we have to read between the lines.
No, and you can pick this up through the text too, with the interaction with the servant and an angel guiding the way, basically pointing to Rebecca, and the blessing from God and his involvement in this selection process. You can clearly see that his hand is in it. It's not, oh, this is what Abraham decided and what ends up happening. You can see the leading of God to this decision as well.
Yeah, there's a plan. So the servant asks what to do if the woman is not willing to follow him. Abraham basically just says, see that you do not bring my son there. God's going to give you an angel to go with you. And then if the woman is not willing to go with you, then you will be free from this covenant. But make sure you don't take my son back there. So they make the covenant in verse 9.
And this is a pretty massive undertaking that he's giving this servant to do, because this isn't exactly a short trip.
No, this is like almost 800 miles, I believe.
Now, granted, he's not going to be driving flocks and herds with him, so he can go a little bit faster than Abraham and his family did, because they had people with them, flocks and herds and things like that.
As a herd of camels, there's 10 of them.
Yeah, so he can still go a bit faster than hundreds and hundreds of animals, because you don't have to herd all of them. But yes, he still has to, you could maybe assume 10 miles a day.
It's going to take him a long time.
Yeah. It's going to take months of this man's life.
But it's going to be fast enough, because later on at the very end of this chapter, it talks about how Isaac was comforted after the death of his mother. So it has to be soon enough that he's still grieving his mother, but culturally and individually, that's a subjective term.
Yeah, for those of us who've lost people, it is a very difficult process, and you can't just slap a number on that and say, well, yeah, he could only reasonably be mourning for a month. Get over it, buddy. After a month, your mom's dead. Who cares? But yeah, I would say that it's probably safe to say this whole thing probably took less than a year.
Yeah. So the servant made the covenant. Then he takes the 10 camels and he goes to the city of Nahor in search of a wife for Isaac. And just to point out, Nahor might have been the name of the city, but it could also have just been the place where Nahor and his offspring settled, Nahor being the relative, I think the brother of Abraham. And some scholars believe this to be Haran, which is the place where Abraham lived in earlier chapters after leaving Ur with his father. So it is a city associated with his family, and it sounds like his family made quite a name for themselves there, whether by renaming the city or just having a new city sprout up over generations.
Yeah, you and I were joking about this because, like, he goes to the well, and I guess all the virgins are there. And
this is the place where the virgins convene in the evening to carry water.
Fellas, I see a bunch of single ladies.
I was like, Cody, where's the we need to find that wife?
If there's, I haven't found it.
Yeah, as I said, yeah, that'd be convenient. Let's just go to the well and see what we get.
How times have changed.
Yeah.
But it's still significant. Like, wells keep popping up. Like, one of the things I like to look at when reading is like constant reoccurrence of places or events. Hagar had an encounter with God at a well.
Twice.
You have Abraham meeting people and interacting with like Abimelech and fighting over. Isaac later fights over the same. You have people meeting others at the well. You have connection to the Old Testament here.
But Jesus did work at the well.
Jesus did work at the. You have Moses doing works at wells. So like this is very much, and throughout Scripture, a idea of life-giving, like the water of life. Jesus connects it to that in the New Testament, but wells are important.
Yes. Notably, Isaac finds Rebekah by proxy at a well. Jacob finds Rachel at a well. Moses finds Zipporah at a well. So it seems to be a wifely place. So right after he decides to go to the well, the servant prays. And I think that's really important. And this is one of those special moments in the Bible that could get overlooked. But I'm going to read his prayer and we'll get into the subject. So the servant says in verse 12, he said, "O Lord God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master." This is the first intercessory prayer done in the Bible by somebody that's not like a prophet or like somebody that's super close to God. This is a lowly servant. Even though he's the highest servant in Abraham's household, he is still a servant. And he's praying for blessings for Abraham and for Isaac. And this is a really good example of praying generously for others that we get in the Old Testament. And you don't get very many examples like this.
No, and this connects to the idea that like God is not just interacting with his quote unquote chosen people that people like to put labels on, and everybody outside this chosen people, everybody outside the elect doesn't really get to interact or benefit from God directly, but I think you have Hagar, the Egyptian woman, benefiting and having theophanies, which is a very rare event for anyone in the Bible, let alone somebody who is out of the elect or chosen people. And you have it again here with the servant as well, getting that connection and an angel present guiding him. And then he's praying to God, like there's a relationship there.
And he's asking God for a sign. Like God is making it known to this servant who doesn't even have a name. And yet God has gone to all of these steps to bless this servant's journey. And then he's, give me a sign. Like the sign will be that the girl offers me a drink and to water my camels. And that's exactly what happens. And then he has confirmation of this and he shares the story with the family. And that validates the experience for them enough that they're like, okay, sure, take our virgin daughter far away. We'll probably never see her again. And Isaac gets married.
And the humility in the way that he prays, he doesn't just pray, Lord, my God. And it may seem that's a bad detail. He's not saying my God. He's saying the God of my master. So what? That's not his God too? No, the point isn't that this isn't the God he believes in. The point is that he is so low, he doesn't feel worthy to say, this is my God. No, this is the God of my master. He's putting himself in where he feels is his proper place. He's, I don't have the authority or the right to call out to you directly. I'm saying, you're the God of my master, but I need this from you and I need help.
This is like such a humility focused moment.
Yes.
We like long for this greatness. Like Cody and I are always like, what is God doing here? Do we compare ourselves to Abraham and Sarah? Is that a thing? Is that respectful? And then you see this prayer, which first and foremost, he has the humility to put himself in the proper position of servanthood. But then he asks for God to show steadfast love to Abraham. It's not even really a blessing of material good or like wife. It's truly just for steadfast love. And it's through this act of providing a bride for Isaac. But his prayer is for Abraham to be blessed by God through steadfast love. How often do we pray for that? In the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Is our daily bread all of this stuff that we want, or is it God's steadfast love?
How often do you have people who want to be the Abraham of a story? They want to be the main character. No one points to the servant in the story and says, I want to be that guy.
Yeah. He didn't ask for anything for himself. He's not, hey, God, give Abraham this Wagyu steak and I'll take a bag of chips. Okay, thanks. Love you. Bye.
But this guy's role is every bit as important and every bit as beautiful as the role that Abraham had. This is a bit part guy. Like you said, Gina, we don't even know this guy's name. And yet without him, this story doesn't happen. Rebecca doesn't end up with Isaac.
And we know from 2 chapters ago, that was God's whole intention. This is his wife. And we've gone to seek her out.
No, and I've heard this talked about in a trivial sense. Oh, she just offers water, but like truly understanding what it is to water camels, that's a laborious activity. If camels are dehydrated, they can drink up to 30 gallons of water in one go, and he has 10 of them with him.
And she's got, I think, a vase or a jar.
Yeah, this would have been a very laborious activity to water the camels and provide water to them, and she's willing to go into it. So this is also connecting to the hospitality that Abraham is known for. And one of the reasons I think Abraham wanted to go outside the Canaanite and Hittite region is to have somebody who is dramatically as hospitable as himself.
There's like a layer of sweetness in this chapter that it's like when you talked about the word for grief for Abraham when Sarah died. There's a sweetness in Rebecca and a sweetness in the story between her and Isaac in the way that it describes how he loves her at the end of this chapter. And I think Rebecca gets a bad reputation because of what happens with Jacob and Esau. But ultimately, she is this innocent young girl who is going out of her way to show hospitality and to, at the end, veil herself and be this worthy, appropriate bride to her husband that I think she does deserve credit here because you have the servant praying, but you also have this young woman who, for all intents and purposes, should have protected herself and turned her back on a stranger instead of treating him with such kindness.
I think ultimately what the servant here is praying for is a righteous woman for Isaac. And as we discussed in our episode on Sodom and Gomorrah, hospitality is a sign of righteousness. For all of Lot's faults, and there were many, he shows hospitality to the angels. Abraham, for his seemingly fewer faults compared to Lot, was also a righteous man, and he shows his righteousness in many ways by his hospitality to the angels. Rebecca here is showing righteousness, even at a very young age, by her selfless sacrifice to water all of these camels. And like you said, Cody, this is something would have taken a long time and would have been very hard for a person she doesn't know. He's a stranger. For all she knows, he could be here for some bad reasons.
And especially back then, like, the well was a place where sometimes people would gather when they were traveling because they were thirsty or hungry. Travelers were not always kind. Like, you hear about in Jesus's journey throughout the land, like, there were some areas that they were shocked that he was willing to go because they were so unfriendly, or like travelers would be unfriendly. So like in this instance, it's crazy that this young woman, if I was her mother, if my 13-year-old daughter saw a random dude with a bunch of camels or horses and was like, hey, let me help you. Like, here's some water and come over for dinner. And yeah, I have room in my house. You can stay with me. I would kill her. And yet she's, yeah, come on over. And then she runs and tells her family and they're like, come on. That's rare hospitality.
I also think it's worth mentioning. This is a slight tangent, but this is something that really bothers me. One of the common things that Muslim apologists do today is they point to this verse as well as the preceding couple chapters, and they say, you see, this means that Rebecca was 3 years old.
What?
Yeah, because they point to the word here that's being used, and they say, this means that she was a young girl. Do some weird math with the genealogy that was mentioned 2 chapters ago, and they say, this means that she was 3 years old. Alhamdulillah, it is the truth. And they do this to justify the marriage of Muhammad to Aisha, who was 6 years old when he married her and consummated the marriage when she was 9. Horrible, disgusting, and terrible. But they try to point to this and say that Rebecca was 3 and Isaac was in his 30s. Therefore, it's okay for Muhammad to have married a 6-year-old. 1, no. But 2, that's not at all what the words here mean. The direct translation, as best as I can tell from the Hebrew here, for who Rebecca is, she is a young woman of very pleasant sight, a virgin. The word young woman here is na'ara, which means young woman. That's literally what it is. It's between the ages of 12 and 20. She's later referred to as being of age, so she is guaranteed to be somewhere in her teenage years at the very least, because you don't count as being of age until you pass into your teenage years. And we talked about this with Isaac, the concept of being weaned. Like, she's not a kid. She's still considered young. She is under the protection of her family, but that's because she's not married yet, so she's not a full woman. For all we know, she could be 20 at this point.
But either way, like, when you're 3 years old, you're not weaned, and there's a different word for that age group.
Correct.
So I'm going to take it as she was probably in her teens.
I just thought that was worth mentioning because it's an argument I'm hearing again more and more often from very aggressive Muslim apologists. And if you're a Christian and you interact with Muslims who are a bit more on the aggressive side, this is something that they will say to try to convince you that Muhammad's marriage was okay, and that Christians are hypocrites.
So it's confirmed that she is the one, and they go through the motions of all of that. And then the servant gives her jewelry.
Yeah, a ring and 2 bracelets.
What kind of ring?
So later on in this very long chapter, you read that it's a nose ring, and the nose ring symbolized betrothed. So that's why later, when you read the post 40, when Laban comes in and sees his sister wearing a ring, takes it seriously.
So the servant asks who her father is and if he can stay with their family for the night. And she lets out that she is a relative of Abraham by sharing who her parents are. And then she does invite them to stay and runs off to tell her parents. And then Laban, her brother, sees her and comes out. Let me go to the verse. So as soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, he heard the words of Rebekah, his sister. Thus the man spoke to me. He went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. He said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? For I have prepared the house and a place for the camels." So the man came to the house and unharnessed the camels and gave straw and fodder to the camels, and there was water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, "I will not eat until I have said what I have to say." He said, "Speak on." So this servant is very persistent and intent on accomplishing what he set out to accomplish fast. So in verse 34, the servant retells the story that was told earlier in the chapter at the beginning when he makes this plan with Abraham. So he retells the story. He lets them know that he was told an angel would be sent with him. It's important to note that the Hebrew word here is not the same as the angel of the Lord. It's probably more of a generic angel, not a Christophany. And then Laban and Bethuel give their blessing for the marriage. So they give their blessing the next morning. They're a little bit more hesitant to send Rebekah off. They want 10 days. He asks not to be delayed. Rebekah agrees to go right away, and they give her a blessing. So, "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him." And that's how they leave it. And then Rebekah and her young women leave on the camels, and they head back towards Isaac. And that's where they meet for the first time. She veils herself. They get married. And he is comforted in his love for Rebekah after the death of his mother.
There are some interesting things going back just a little bit.
Yeah.
Verse 50. Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, "The thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good." It's very clear that this is a household that worships Yahweh. And it is actually Yahweh. It's not Elohim or Adonai here. It is Yahweh. These are people who know who God is. So that may be just another reason why it is that this is the family that's reached out to. But it's also interesting that this is a choice that is handed over to Rebekah. This isn't a choice made for her, and she did have the chance to say no, but she said yes. So this is a story that can't happen without a lot of people doing what's right.
Cooperating, yeah.
If the servant doesn't go, it doesn't happen. If the servant doesn't seek the Lord out, this doesn't happen. He could have, again, chosen a random family. Just been like, okay, I'm here. It's taken forever for me to get here. I'm just going to find a lady.
To the neighboring town and just come up with an elaborate lie and been done with it and not had to travel so far. There's so many possibilities here, but he did the righteous thing.
And Laban and Bethuel could have said, no chance. She's under our protection. But they also say, this is clearly from God. We worship God. We're going to respect him. But at the same time, this is our daughter's choice. There's a lot of respect to God, but also to the people here. And it's very nice. It's very wholesome, honestly, to see a story in the Bible where everyone is showing an enormous amount of respect to one another and an enormous amount of respect to God, but also acknowledging that people have a choice here. And right or wrong, it's a decision they need to make.
Yeah.
And Rebekah could have chosen wrong here, but she didn't. And thank God for that.
I would like to point out that Laban is also Rachel and Leah's father later on. That's notable. Same guy.
Yeah, knowing the 10 days that they ask for could give you a little indication of why Laban is so sketchy later with Leah and Rachel.
Could be.
Also, it's an interesting thing to point out because while he does clearly worship God here, eventually he does turn to idol worship. So it is very fortunate that the interaction is now while he still is a follower of God rather than later when he turns to the worship of idols.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.